Across to the JSE to Gary Booysen, who we lost before, just to give us an update on the markets. Gary, I hope you can hear me. What's the latest on the markets and why are we seeing markets still fairly subdued?
Nompu, I've got no sound on this side, but I think you were asking about the US trade war and what was potentially happening over there. Currently, there's a lot of confusion. So obviously we got that announcement on Friday that potentially, it was actually the story was broken by Reuters, saying that potentially we were going to have a delisting of some of the Chinese companies from US exchanges, and that the US was considering really putting in firm exchange controls, trying to limit the portfolio flows that are going into the Chinese economy. On Saturday, we had Treasury spokeswoman Monica Crowley coming out and saying that they were in fact not considering it. So there's all sorts of confusion coming out of the US authorities at the moment, and this has got the market a little bit nervous. So locally, obviously, we had Tito Mboweni speaking and presenting a growth plan that was potentially very, very good for South African markets and should have been potentially good for the rand. But just because of the magnitude of the concerns around global growth and what potentially a limiting of portfolio flows could do to global growth, we've seen that there's been a little bit of risk-off sentiment, and that's limited gains on our market today.
Gary, I hope you can hear me now. I understand technically you should be able to, but in terms of emerging markets generally, are we seeing does the risk-off environment now create a bit of downward pressure on EM markets?
Now, certainly we're seeing it in the emerging market currencies, and the rand is actually holding up fairly well. So we're sitting at about, I'd say about 50. It's about 15 rand 19 when I left the office, and against the dollar, and that seems to be holding. Now, when you have a look at it, the emerging market currencies are under pressure. We've weakened slightly, but this is really a dollar-based story. It seems like investors are moving into the dollar as a safe haven asset. One of the ways that we track this is we look at what's called the dollar index. Now, the dollar index is the dollar versus a basket of international currencies, and we're seeing that now making around a 1-week high. It's also putting some pressure on commodity prices like gold, which are obviously measured in dollars. So that is helping to I suppose put pressure on EM currencies in general. Certainly the risk-off situation isn't being helped by the announcements that we're getting out of the US and the potential for further escalation in the trade war. But one good thing that we did see was the solid manufacturing numbers coming out of China. So with those really strong PMI numbers, I think that's helped to lift sentiment across the emerging market and limit the losses that we could potentially see. Obviously, the PMI number of above 50 means expansion, and with 51.4, that's the most rapid expansion that we've seen in the Chinese manufacturing sector in 19 months. You've got to remember that the Chinese manufacturing sector makes up around 30% of Chinese GDP. That's according to the first half numbers. So it's a significant portion of the sector, and to be growing at this pace certainly should be cheering some investors.
So when we hear good news out of China, economic news at least, that should bode quite well for commodities. What are we seeing on the commodities front?
So like I said, we've seen some of the commodity prices that are dollar-based under a little bit of pressure just because of the rapid appreciation we've seen in the dollar. So if you compare the dollar and the pound, if you compare it against the South African rand, for example, the rand is around 12% weaker for the year against the dollar, but only just over 7% weaker against the pound. So, in spite of the strong dollar, and if we try and strip out the dollar effect and look at commodities, you're actually seeing the commodity prices doing fairly well. So while gold is flat to slightly down, you're seeing the likes of palladium actually making all-time highs today. So it was around $1,700 an ounce, which is significant. I mean, palladium is obviously one of the PGM metals, and that rally that we've seen there is very much a fundamentally driven rally as the market moves away from the pure platinum play and into more basket products.
So, Gary, we heard over the weekend that Finance Minister Tito Mboweni spoke with his ANC NEC colleagues to say that it's really important for them to get started with the structural reforms, talking about the reconfiguration of SOEs, getting rid of, or at least not funding SOEs that are no longer bringing a return and so on, creating competition in the transport space against Transnet and all of that. And then on top of that, we heard that the president appointed a presidential Presidential Advisory Council, and the president today also wrote a letter to the nation basically saying what he's planning to do, that we're going to have a more concrete growth plan in the next few weeks. When you hear all of this, what does this do for you and your sentiment as a person playing on the markets? Does it move you at all to think differently about South Africa, or you want to see action?
Certainly, I think we want to see action. If you look at the presidential letter, one of the big criticisms around the Ramaphosa presidency has been the lack of action. There was a lot of hope, a lot of optimism around, broad sweeping reforms. And if you actually read the letter today, he was saying that the structural issues and the challenges facing South Africa are not something that you can turn around in the short term. And I think the idea of a weekly letter going out to the public is very positive. It's a way that I think the presidency can almost recapture control of the narrative, because these days with social media and so many other outlets for news, it's sometimes we forget how important it is to listen to the leadership. So I think that's in general a positive move. Hopefully it does translate to actual fundamental reforms. Looking at the comments by Tito Mboweni over the weekend, I think that is also incredibly positive for South Africa. I think obviously Tito Mboweni, now finance minister, coming out of the Reserve Bank, has taken lessons from the limits that monetary policy can limits to the action monetary policy can have on the underlying economy, and the fact that we need these structural reforms is absolutely crucial. So limiting the size of our state-owned entities, the government trying to divest from state-owned entities that are not strictly serving the public. I think this is wonderful news for South Africans, and I would have expected to see more optimism coming into our market. Unfortunately, as I said before, our market is very much trading on international factors at the moment, and I think discounting some very, very positive news.
And then lastly, Gary, on the company news front, any interesting stocks today?
Yeah, very much. Again, I'm going to have to focus internationally, because that's really what's driving markets at the moment. So, interestingly, we saw Alibaba, which is obviously the giant internet marketplace, kind of the Chinese, one of the Chinese competitors to Amazon, getting really punished on the US exchange on Friday. It was down over 5% based on those comments out of the White House. We're looking for a bounce back when the US markets open today, and I think that could be a quick short-term turnaround, which will be very, very exciting.
Super. Thanks very much, Gary, and thank you so much for your patience. That was Gary Booysen. He's from Rand Swiss. Let's take a look at how other African markets and currencies are performing.